that was started during the election campaign about American economic growth. As most of you know, since the bottom of the recession in 2009, our economy has been growing steadily at a rate that by historical standards is quite pathetic, 2% per year. And in the election campaign, now President Trump promised to raise that to a sustained level of 3.5% to 4%, almost doubling that rate of growth. The Trump budget that's been proposed assumes for the next 10 years 3% growth in real GDP, and that 3% growth instead of 2% is enough to pay for the tax cuts that the administration wants Congress to approve. But there are actually some strong reasons why 2% may be even faster than we can achieve, and over the next 10 years, our growth will be less than 2%, not the 3.5% or 4% that we were promised. Now, the growth that we've achieved has been from the very bottom of the recession. From that bottom, our unemployment rate has fallen from 10 to 4.4%. That means that the growth in labor that has been fueling the growth in GDP has been made possible by a steady decline in the unemployment rate. But unemployment can't fall much further. The lowest unemployment has gone in the last 50 years is 3.8%, and we're getting pretty close to that. So the question I'm going to ask is, once unemployment gets to wherever the lowest possible rate is, and we're getting close to that, how fast can the economy grow? And in order to answer that question, I looked at two different periods of time when the unemployment rate was essentially the same as it is now. I looked at 1970, when the unemployment rate was about 4.5%. I looked at 2006, about a decade ago, when the unemployment rate was about 4.5%. And I looked at the last quarter of 2016, when the unemployment rate was about 4.5%. So if you look over those two periods, 1970 to 2006, and then compare that to the last 10 years, you have this startling slowdown from 3.2% GDP growth to only 1.3%. Now, where did that 1.3% come from when I just said that the economy had been growing at 2%? The 2% is from the bottom of the recession. If you go back before the recession to the prosperity of 2006 and link that 2006 together with 2016, then that number is only 1.3. So that's an indication of what our economy has been capable of. And if we look at the reasons for the slowdown after 2006, it's about 50-50 divided up between slower productivity growth, that's output per hour, slowing from 1.8 to 0.9, falling by half, and slowing growth in hours of work. And this is the thing that is so often missed. Our growth story is not just a productivity story. It's an hours of work story. And if you divide up that decline of 1% in hours of work, it's about 0.4 due to slower population growth, which we don't hear about very often, and 0.6% reduction in the growth of hours per person, which we're going to see later on is related to the decline in labor force participation, the percent of the population that's at work. So how fast is our economy capable of growing? We have data techniques that can answer that question for a fixed unemployment rate. So if we abstract from all the ups and downs of recessions and booms and expansions and just ask, factoring out the business cycle, how fast can our economy grow? Here's the answer since 1953. The numbers on the very left-hand side, back in the 1950s and 1960s, show growth of 3.5% to 4%. Then in the 1970s and 1980s, that middle period, growth slowed down to about 3%. There was a brief revival in the late 1990s that we'll come back to, and then a steady decline in the economy's capability of growing till we reach the last 7 or 8 years, where the economy at a constant unemployment rate is capable of growing at only about 1.3%. Here's the same technique applied to productivity, or growth in output per hour. Here you see the slowdown in the 70s and 80s is more dramatic, and the revival of productivity growth in the heyday of the dot-com era in the late 1990s, with all that high-tech investment, was a very substantial revival, but it didn't last very long. And productivity growth now, in a sustained basis at a constant unemployment rate, has fallen back down to about 0.5% per year. I've joined the green productivity line with a sort of orange line that shows growth in output per capita. This is how fast our standard of living can grow at a constant unemployment rate. And you'll notice that in the last 15 years or so, output per capita is growing slower than productivity, and that's because the number of hours of work per member of the population has been going down, partly because prime-age adult males and females are working less than they used to, but also because for the last 10 years we've had the beginning of the long-predicted phenomenon of baby boom retirement. So what are the sources of slowdown in the United States? How does it differ from other countries? Productivity growth slowdown that you've seen so dramatically here in that chart is universal to all the developed countries. Western Europe, UK, Japan, even the formerly fast-growing four tigers, South Korea, Singapore, Hong Kong, all have been slowing down in their productivity growth. So that's universal across the developed world. I'm not going to say a thing today until we get to the Q&A about the emerging markets. China, India, they're all growing fast as they catch up to the developed world, and that will continue. But there are some special problems for the United States that are not shared uniformly with Japan or Western Europe. We have a problem with education. We have a problem with inequality. That means that much of the pathetic growth that we're achieving is going to the top 1% of the income distribution. And we have some issues with sociological decay, with an increasing mortality rate, with a declining marriage rate, with other kinds of things you would consider more in the realm of sociology than in economics. But that's factoring in to slowing our growth capabilities. Now, as we look back and try to understand why growth was faster back in earlier eras, the organizing principle that economists rely on are the idea of different industrial revolutions. You've all heard of the first industrial revolution back in the late 18th century with steam engines that made possible railroads and steamships, with cotton spinning and weaving, with the transition from wood to steel. That was the revolution that got economic growth going in the 19th century, but it wasn't very fast. What really caused economic growth to take off was the second industrial revolution, the coming together of an incredible set of innovations that all took place in the very last years of the 19th century, early years of the 20th century. Starting off with electricity, the electric light, elevators, subways, electric portable and fixed machines, later air conditioning, and household appliances. Simultaneously with the invention of electricity in 1879 came the first workable internal combustion engine that gave us motor vehicles and air transport. Then we had the whole set of entertainment and communication inventions, starting with the telegraph in 1844, the telephone in 1875, then radio, phonographs, motion pictures, and finally television. We had an old invention going back to the Romans, but only came into fruition in urban America in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Running water, waste disposal, everybody finally having a bathroom and getting rid of the outhouses. We had a set of inventions that started in the late 19th century in chemicals. And then the most fruitful decade for the invention of plastics was the 1930s, the Great Depression decade. Antibiotics came in with World War II, and modern medicine soon after that. And throughout all of this revolution, the second industrial revolution, we had an utter change in working conditions in both the job and the home. So just think of some of the things that could only happen once. We could only once transfer our society from a mainly rural society of 1870 to a mainly urban society by 1950. Only once could we make the transition from light that required a match to make a light that had a flickering flame that was polluting and dirty to an instant off-on switch. Only once could we move the speed of human travel from the hoof and the sail of 1820 to the Boeing 707 of 1958. Only once could we change from an indoor temperature that was alternating between super cold in the winter and super hot in the summer to year-round 72 degrees thanks to central heating and air conditioning. Only once could we move from horse-drawn communication to instant communication through the telegraph and telephone. Only once the transition to bathrooms and running water. And the biggest transition of all, life expectancy increased from age 47 at the turn of the 20th century to the upper 70s now, and most of that transition took place by 1950. In fact, the rate of increase of life expectancy was twice as fast in the first half of the 20th century as it was in the second half. Well, that brings us to the third industrial revolution, the one that you're all thinking about, the digital revolution. We had, of course, the entertainment moving from black and white television to color, to cable, to streaming, information technology moving from the mainframe and mini computers through the personal computers, the web and e-commerce. We've had the communication revolution that gave us the mobile phone and the smartphone. And then finally, productivity enhancers, as I call them, the ATM machine, barcode scanning at retail, and instant credit card authorization that greatly speeded up retail checkout. How can we characterize the difference between the big monumental progress that was made by the second industrial revolution and the slower progress that's been made since? There was a very interesting article published back in 2000 at the time of the millennium by somebody who I know, and I'll tell you about him at the end. But what he's doing is saying, let's say somebody dozed off in 1939 and woke up in the year 2000. That's 61 years apart. Despite the 61-year blackout, this former dozer waking up would find a familiar world that made basic sense. He could drive a 2000 car since the steering wheel, gas pedal, and radio are exactly where they were in 1939. He would understand records, telephones, light bulbs, electricity, central heating, x-rays, Social Security, insured savings, women voting, network broadcasting, and airplanes, all without explanation. But let's say we do that 61-year falling asleep 61 years earlier. Let's go back from 1939 to 1878 and say that somebody went to sleep in 1878 and woke up in 1939. He would blink in disbelief because he wouldn't recognize the modern world he saw in 1939. He wouldn't know about gas pedals because there were no cars in 1878. He wouldn't know about internal combustion engines or about electric motors you need to start them. The idea of pictures that moved would be strange. Sending voices and music through the air in invisible waveforms would be inexplicable. Imagine his astonishment at being lifted above the clouds in a 1939 vintage DC-3, or talking to somebody 10,000 miles away on the phone. He would be astonished going up 104 floors in the Empire State Building or riding in the subways below the surface of New York City. So that's a great way of summing up the difference in the speed of change between 1878 and 1939, and then 1939 to 2000. Now, why did this guy write about 1939? I happen to know he lives in Wilmette, Illinois, right next to Evanston, and he has his own beautifully preserved 1939 Buick that he owns. So that's the difference in the speed of change. Now, here's another way of looking at different historical eras. The height of these three bars is labor productivity growth. The left bar is 1890 to 1920, the middle bar is 1920 to 1970, and the right-hand bar is 1970 until now. The height of the bars is labor productivity growth, about 1.5% in the first and third periods, close to 3% in the middle period. The yellow slices tell you how much of that productivity growth was contributed by education. The brown bars show how much was contributed by more machines per worker, which we call capital deepening. And the black bars show how much was contributed by everything else, all the innovations, including the shift from the rural to the urban society. And as you can see, the black bars dominate the explanation. The economist jargon for that is total factor productivity growth, after we've already factored out the contribution of education and more machines per worker. Now here's a close-up look at total factor productivity growth over the post-war period. And as you can see, once again, we've got this pattern of fast growth in the 50s and 60s, slower growth in the 70s and 80s, this very robust revival associated with the dot-com decade of the late 1990s, early 2000s, and then we're back in the dumps again with very little total factor productivity growth. And we'll be thinking for the next few minutes about why that's happened. In my view, the third industrial revolution has failed the test of total factor productivity compared to the second industrial revolution. After all, the second industrial revolution gave us 50 years of rapid TFP growth and labor productivity growth. The third industrial revolution only seems to have given us about 8 years between 1996 and 2004. And I think there's a good reason for that, because the third industrial revolution with all the computers was mainly affecting business productivity without much effect on the consumer. The consumer's life was unalterably changed by the second industrial revolution. Think of kitchen appliances. Think of going from the scrub board to the automatic washing machine and the dryer. Now, this third industrial revolution went through phases. We started out in 1970 with repetitive retyping, with calculations that required an old-fashioned Marchant calculator where you punched buttons and the machine went clunk, clunk, clunk to do a multiplication or a division. In the 1970s, we got memory typewriters and electronic calculating machines. In the 1980s, we got personal computers. By the late 1980s, we were doing email. We had link up between personal computers within business firms running proprietary software. And then in the 1990s, it all came together with much faster computers, more capable, higher memories, the web arriving around 1995, then flat screens, and pretty much a business environment that is very familiar to what we have today. Much of business work is still being done with the desktops and the laptops that are not that much different than they were 10 years ago. There is lots of change going on. There's lots of innovation. But the fundamental way the business world is operating has not changed that much in the last 10 years. I've already mentioned desktop and laptop computers are being used much as they were 10 years ago. Leaving aside e-commerce, which is still only 8% of retail sales, we have standing still in bricks and mortar retail. We still have shelves stocked by humans. We still have meat and cheese being sliced behind deli counters by humans. We still have humans at the checkout. In finance, we had ATM machines invented 35, 40 years ago. We still have almost 100,000 bank branches in the United States. 20 years ago, Wall Street transitioned from trading a few million shares a day to trading a billion or more shares a day. That was 20 years ago that transition happened. In medicine, the big change in the last 10 years has been electronic medical records. But we still have doctors, we still have nurses. The big difference is when you go in to see your doctor, instead of looking you over, he's staring at the computer screen. And higher education is the hotbed of slow productivity growth, with rising administrative costs, rising tuition, as you all know if you have college-age children, and ever more administrators relative to instructional staff. So what about the new inventions? There's lots of innovation going on, but still total factor productivity is not responding. Why is that? Well, 3D printing is a great way of making models and prototypes, but it's not mass production. You can't make 17 million automobiles a year with 3D printing. Robots are great, but robots have been around for a long time. The first industrial robot was introduced by General Motors in 1961, and by the mid-1990s in auto factories, we had robots already welding together the bodies and taking over the noxious job of painting the cars in the paint shop. So robots have been entering into manufacturing. They're now in warehouses. But how capable are robots really of taking over for human activity in the service sector? An interesting experiment was reported by the New York Times a while ago of a robot competition held by the research arm of the Defense Department that brought 25 robotics engineers and their creations together in Pomona, California. These robots were asked to do simple tasks: walk up steps, turn a valve, operate a power drill. It would take a human 5 or 10 minutes at most to do these tasks. The winning robot took 45 minutes. Many of them struggled badly, falling down steps, taking a long time to figure things out, even with remote-controlled assistance. Turning a knob to open a door proved daunting to many. One young observer of the competition suggested, if you're worried about the Terminator, just keep your door closed. What about autonomous vehicles? What about self-driving cars and trucks? We hear a lot about them, and they are surely coming, with the jobs of long-distance truck drivers perhaps the most threatened. But we're not there yet, and we were warned with a caution by the much-respected consumer magazine, Consumer Reports, just a few months ago. Experts agree that it will be a very long time before autonomous vehicles will have free reign over every road in America. Before that happens, every road, highway, byway, bridge, and obstacle needs to be mapped. And we're not talking about ordinary maps currently on your car's navigation system. We're talking about 3D maps that capture all the features of the road. Weather's a big concern. Snow can cover up lane markers. A self-driving car's software has to be ready for bizarre circumstances. Say if a police officer or traffic worker waves a car into oncoming traffic lanes to avoid an obstacle. Could a car know to stop at a green light to avoid hitting a person chasing his dog into the street? And I might add to that quote, can a self-driving car really notice when you're looking for a parking space on the street that somebody is walking down the street and might be getting into the car, leading a human to stop and wait? But would the self-driving car know to do that? Artificial intelligence is where the real action is, and surely artificial intelligence is already making progress. Every time you make a airline reservation on an airline website, you're using artificial intelligence. You put travel agents out of business, just as customer service workers have been put out of business by voice recognition customer service telephone lines. We've got great progress in language translation, legal services. Legal searches are creating unemployment for young lawyers because computers can do it better. We now have robo-advice starting to replace personal financial advisors. How big is the impact? Well, McKinsey Quarterly, a much respected management journal, brought together 375 representatives of large corporations and asked them about the effect of big data and artificial intelligence on their operations. 3/4 of those respondents answered that so far AI and big data had reduced their costs or raised their revenue by less than 1%. So it's coming, but it's coming slowly. And we've already seen a lot of the effects of artificial intelligence in the simple transaction that you do with Amazon every day. That's artificial intelligence that's already here. It's not some magical thing that's suddenly going to arrive with a great jolt in 2 years and 6 months. So what about jobs? There's a famous study that was done 4 years ago by 2 Oxford economists named Frey and Osborne that suggested that in the next 20 years, 47% of American jobs will be eliminated. Now, that seemed a little strange to me, given the fact that our economy has created 15 million new jobs in the last 8 years. Let's look at some of their examples and see how credible you think this is. Now, this was made a prediction in 2013, so by 2033, do you really think that this is going to happen? The following jobs will be eliminated. 55% of commercial airline pilots. Sorry, Frey and Osborne, but the FAA has not anywhere close to allowing commercial aircraft to be flown with one pilot instead of two. 86% of real estate agent jobs will disappear. 92% of jobs of retail salespeople will disappear. Do you really believe that's going to happen within the next 15 years? We've already had 4 years of their 20 years that's already occurred. So jobs are not disappearing. The problem is that computers working with people often work with them rather than replacing them. Barcode scanning did not make checkout clerks disappear, it made them more efficient. Radiologists have their diagnosis informed by computers, but radiologists still have their jobs. There are reasons to worry. Over the last 15 years, we've seen a real hollowing out. We've seen a decline in blue-collar work in manufacturing and clerical work that's been replaced by computers. And we've seen, as a counterpart of that, an increase in highly skilled jobs at the top and an increase in low-skilled jobs with all the service workers in restaurants, hospitals, universities. And this hollowing out of employment for middle-skilled, particularly men, but also women who were in things like customer service, has had some very unfortunate social and economic consequences. Middle-skilled job loss has caused a decline in actual outcomes compared to people's expectations for what a good job would be, expectations they inherited from their parents and their grandparents. We've seen the result of this in prime-aged males and females dropping out of the labor force, and we'll come back and I'll show you a chart about that in a minute. Males have become less attractive marriage partners, and we've seen a decline in marriage. The share of college graduates made up of females is close to 60%, only 40% male. And that means that we have a lot more highly educated women than men, again, contributing to the decline in marriage. We have adverse consequences of the many single-parent families raising children. And the children from single-parent families are less likely to finish high school, less likely to go to college, more likely to engage in crime. And we have this stunning turnaround in life expectancy and mortality. For white Americans who have a high school education or less, the mortality rate, the rate at which people are dying, has actually increased for the last 15 years, interrupting a steady improvement with declining mortality that's been true in every other developed country except the United States. Something that's been called to widespread attention by Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton at Princeton. There are some other consequences of this socioeconomic change. We have children born out of wedlock for white high school graduates going from 40 to 34%, black high school graduates going from 48 to 74%. Over the 50 years between 1960 and 2010, if we look just at the bottom one-third of the white population, those with high school or less education, and take 40-year-old women, the percent of their biological children living with both parents has declined over that 50-year period from 95 to 34%. That's just a stunning change. And as I said before, rising death rates of middle-income, middle-aged Americans, something that Angus Deaton has labeled deaths of despair. They're connected to opioid addiction, alcohol addiction, and suicide. Now, American economic growth, in addition to being affected by these socioeconomic events, is affected by what I call the four headwinds. They're education, slowing growth in educational attainment, demography, that's that decline in labor force participation I mentioned before, rising inequality with so much of the income going to the top 1%, and what I call the fiscal headwind, the rising debt load that Americans are having to face. In the United States, we have still only about 80% of high school students completing high school. Most people who go to two-year community colleges drop out. Four-year college degree attainment is slowly increasing, but 40% of recent college graduates cannot find a job that requires a college education. We have a lot of taxi drivers and baristas who have gone to a four-year college. And we have the incredibly high costs of college tuition and growing indebtedness, with $1.4 trillion of college debt, more college debt than there is debt for auto loans, for instance. In international competitions, the United States does poorly compared to other developed countries. The so-called PISA test given to 15-year-olds around the world, the United States ranked 17th in reading, 20th in science, 27th in math. The United States used to have the most educated population as a percent going to college. Think back to the GI Bill after World War II that financed free college education for returning veterans. We've now slid to number 16 in terms of our college attainment compared to other countries. And all of this is going to reduce future economic growth. Remember those yellow bars that were contributions to productivity growth over the last century? The size of those yellow education contributions is declining as the percent of people going to college slows its advance. Here's the labor force participation rate over the last 50 years, the great advance as women entered the labor force, peaking out in the late 1990s, and then this precipitous decline in labor force participation. Notice the leveling off in the last 2 years. That's a hopeful sign, but much of that decline in labor force participation is not just baby boom people retiring, but also prime-aged men and women dropping out of the labor force. The participation of prime-aged men, that's age 25 to 54, has gone from about 97, 98% in the 1950s down to 88% by 2015, 2016. And if you look at only high school graduates, their labor force participation, age 25 to 54, when you'd think everybody would be working, has gone down to 84%. We have the lowest male labor force participation of any country in the rich man's club, as it's called, the OECD, of any country besides Italy, the lowest female participation of any country besides Israel and Italy. Prime-age females, we have 8 points fewer women working than in Canada, and much of that can be attributed to our lack of government policies that provide parental leave for mothers with newborn children. Here's the decline in the labor force participation rate of prime-aged men. And in a new paper that's being given today, literally today, at a conference in Washington, the author has traced fully a quarter of this decline in male labor force participation to opioid addiction, to the drug problem that we've heard so much about. Inequality, you've all heard about the rise in inequalities. Some of the numbers are startling. In the last 20 years, 50% roughly of all the income gains have gone to the top 1% of the income distribution. And this is continuing. It's not over. Think of the enormous pay packages that go to sports and entertainment stars. Think of the pay packages to CEOs. Roger Ailes got kicked out of Fox News, but with a very handsome pay package, as did Bill O'Reilly. And we still have a gradual transition that we read about just this week in the New York Times between employment with steady work being contracted out to so-called contract work. There was the contrast you may have read about in the New York Times between Kodak in the 1980s and what a janitor's job was like then compared to a janitor working for a contract firm at Apple in Cupertino, California today. The final headwind, the fiscal headwind, this is the projection of the growth in the ratio of US federal debt to GDP. This inexorable rise in the future eventually will have to be countered by higher taxes or reduced Social Security or Medicare benefits. So the combined effect of the headwinds, slower growth in educational attainment, pushes down productivity growth directly. The demographic headwind reduces growth in hours per person and holds down the growth of our standard of living. Inequality reduces the growth in median income compared to average growth in income. And the fiscal headwind means that eventually we're going to have higher taxes or lower benefits as a result of this fiscal burden. So almost done. Here's the consequence. The red bars show what we've achieved over the last century, from 1920 to 2014. The blue bars show what I predict for the next 25 years. And the first pair of bars over on the left is labor productivity growth, down from 2.2 to 1.2. I'm actually predicting productivity growth considerably faster than it's actually been in the last 5 or 6 years, when it's only been about half a point. Moving over to the second pair of bars, output per person is going to grow slower than productivity because of the retirement of the baby boom generation. Then, if inequality continues to increase, median income growth will be slower than average income growth as a disproportionate share of income goes to the top. And then finally, another slice off for the prospective increase in taxes or reduction in benefits. So you see that instead of this steady 2% growth in our standard of living that we got used to over the 20th century, we're looking into the future at an increase in our standard of living of barely half a point, maybe even less than that. So here are some policy issues that you might want to address in the Q&A. President Trump promised 3.5 or 4% sustained growth, but there are strong forces that are going to push the growth rate down, not up. We've been able to grow as fast as 2% because unemployment has declined, but how much faster can it decline? We have the continuing retirement of the baby boom generation. The prospective growth rate, the Census Bureau says the growth rate of the population in working ages 18 to 64 is only going to be 0.5% growth in population over the next 40 years. Continuation of slow productivity growth. Well, and what about tax cuts? Can they raise growth? Not if they're deficit neutral. And there are plenty of people in Congress who are reluctant to add more to the federal debt with the future of the debt as dire as I've shown you. So here's the conclusion. 70% of all growth in total factor productivity, that is taking aside education and more machines per worker, that contribution of innovation, 70% of it occurred in the 5 central decades of the 20th century. The big impacts on productivity of the third industrial revolution were pretty much over by 2005. Innovation continues, but a lot of it has less impact. A lot of innovation that's going into electric cars, self-driving cars. If a person is driven in a self-driving car from home to work, that does not change the productivity of the business sector of the economy. Truck drivers, it will, but people in cars, no. Much of the slowdown in future growth is caused by the headwinds, not productivity growth itself. But there is a ray of hope. Because we're not on the verge of a AI, artificial intelligence, super revolution that some techno-optimists predict, we're not going to see a mass destruction of jobs. So I leave you on that happy and optimistic note. We've created 15 million new jobs in the last 8 years. We're still creating them at a rate of 2 to 2.5 million, and I expect that to continue well into the future. Thank you.